There we go.
Hi, everybody. So thank you so much again for joining us today. My name's Emma Bowers. I'm a highly specialist speech and language therapist with AT Therapy. My specialisms are in traumatic brain injury and socio-emotional mental health needs. So Laura, if we could just go to the next slide.
We can if it'll let me go there.
Have a little mouse wiggle.
There we go. This one?
Yes. So today we're going to discuss and reflect upon the different high-level speech, language, and communication needs that may arise following a traumatic brain injury. So my intentions for today are to share with you the social and cognitive communication difficulties that may arise, the interactions between SEMH and a traumatic brain injury, and then the role of the speech and language therapist within this client population. Next slide. So let's start by reflecting upon social and cognitive communication difficulties. Next slide, please, okay. Altered communication is common following a traumatic brain injury, with reported incident rates of more than 75% following moderate to severe injury. However, previous cross-sectional research has shown increased substance use, disruptive behaviour, school violence, and conduct problems in participants with a history of mild TBI. So there's currently research further exploring the effects of a mild TBI, and research suggests that about 15% continue to suffer symptoms that can be severely debilitating. Thus, mild injury may be anything but mild. Cognitive communication difficulties resulting from disrupted cognition, as opposed to specific language disorder, are the most prevalent communication disorder following a traumatic brain injury. Now, cognitive communication difficulties result in devastating long-term consequences, such as fewer social contacts, low mood, loss of employment, social isolation, and family breakdown. And as Ethan Perel noted, the quality of your life ultimately depends on the quality of your relationships. So this is such an important and prominent area. Communication, relationship support, and social participation are all common areas of difficulties following a traumatic brain injury, whether this is mild or moderate to severe. These areas of difficulties can shatter not only injured person's lives, but those around them. However, these are areas which were highlighted as key unmet needs for families. Next slide, please.
Sorry, I don't know. It's a new laptop. And it seems to be a different click every time. There we go.
Okay, so what are cognitive communication difficulties even? Well, communication is a highly complex skill which forms part of what we call cognition. Cognitive communication disorders are problems with communication that have an underlying cause in a cognitive deficit rather than a primary language or speech deficit, such as aphasia or dysarthria. A cognitive communication disorder results from impaired functioning of one or more cognitive processes. If brain injury impairs any of these skills, then it can affect the ability to communicate successfully. These cognitive processes cannot be viewed in isolation. They work together, and a problem with one or more cognitive functions can cause difficulty performing activities of daily living safely and efficiently, as well as communicating effectively. So let's look at these processes on the next slide. Okay, so attention. So, I'm going to discuss how these things can all impact on communication. So with attention, it could be difficulties with filtering out stimulus or distractions, selective concentration, or focusing attention on non-salient points. Memory, recall of events, auditory recall, remembering and sequencing time, even just being able to answer, what have you been up to, can be a real significant difficulty for some of these clients that we may work with. Perception, so the interpretation of sensory information. Insight and judgment, which is, our awareness of self and others, recognition of different people's perspectives, understanding the grey areas of social communication, because social nuances are not black and white, understanding of one's own limitations and what that means for them and their life. Organisation, so arranging ideas in useful order, including language and sentences. Orientation, so knowing where, when, and who you are, as well as why you're there. Language, so understanding of receptive language or words for communication, known as expressive language. Processing speed of verbal language and other sensory information, so being able to attend, process, and understand at an appropriate rate to keep up with either communication, social interactions, or even just in the classroom. Problem solving, so finding solutions to obstacles or social problems and being able to repair this appropriately to resolve that conflict. Reasoning is the logical thinking through situations, weighing up information appropriately to contribute to making an informed decision, capacity decision making, and objectively viewing the facts of the matter. Executive functioning and self-regulation skills are the mental processes that enable us to plan, focus attention, remember instructions, and juggle multiple tasks successfully. Metacognition is the awareness and understanding of our own thought processes. Cognitive fatigue can impact as well, like quite significantly. So this is where the brain has to work harder to concentrate on tasks that you used to be able to do much more easily before the brain injury. Literal interpretation, so taking language literally, understanding that words people say are not always what they mean. When we say it's raining cats and dogs, it's not actually raining cats and dogs, and understanding of that figurative language. But there's also impaired social communication skills on top of those cognition skills, which all interact with one another, because you need those cognition skills to be able to socially interact appropriately. So let's take a closer look now at social communication skills on the next slide. Now, I personally find using Alex Kelly's hierarchy of social skills incredibly useful and beneficial to clearly outline and profile the range of social skill strengths and or needs a client may present with. The first level of this hierarchy, so our foundation, is awareness of self, others, and our own self-esteem. And this includes things like awareness of our own strengths and needs, but also recognizing and responding to feelings both in ourselves and others appropriately, or for example, managing difficult situations appropriately. You need to have awareness of what's going on around you to be able to do that. Non-verbal communication is what we would commonly refer to as body language. So this includes your kind of typical things such as eye contact, proximity, not getting too close to somebody, and turn taking. Conversational skills are the skills that are actually needed to successfully partake in a conversation. So that might be starting or ending conversations appropriately, asking and answering questions, or listening to others. Now, it's called friendship skills in the hierarchy, but ultimately this is relationship skills as well. It's not just specific to friendships. This can be family, romantic, everything around you. And it covers skills such as coping with peer pressure appropriately, dealing with conflict, and negotiating with others to arrive at a decision. Now, assertiveness skills are equally as important, but ultimately rely on having quite strong skills at all of those foundational levels. So it's being able to express feelings or needs effectively, being able to stand up for yourself, suggest, disagree, complain, apologize, and even just asking for help. It's often why a lot of people within this population can struggle asking for help alongside trauma, which we will discuss a little bit later on. So let's go to our next slide. And in addition to those internal social skill and mastery of them, a client also needs to be able to kind of understand that external world around them. So recognition and understanding of social rules, which if we think about it is super difficult because there's so many different social rules, and we kind of learn by incident, we learn by experience. We're not often kind of sat and told all of these different social rules because there's so many. Flexible thinking, empathy, problem solving, insight and judgment, logical reasoning. I'm going to have a drink, sorry. I was going to try and wait, but I can't. Navigating social nuances, foresight and generalization, and transference of skills as well. So let's look at some more confounding factors on our next slide. And what, these confounding factors that make social and cognitive communication interactions increasingly difficult for a person with a traumatic brain injury, with wide room for error, are additional areas of comorbidity. Now, some of these examples may include the relationship between intellectual abilities and executive functions can be independently preserved. So this is referred to as knowing. But application of this, so acting on intention, can be significantly affected by impairments associated with the prefrontal cortex. So this doesn't mean that in the moment they can become aware of it or anticipate what to do to change behavior, and is known as the frontal lobe paradox. But this can also explain why clients can perform, appropriately during social communication tasks in therapy, but then behave inappropriately in natural settings. Initiating action and self-structuring skills relies heavily on the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. These can be very difficult for clients following a traumatic brain injury, such as use of spare time appropriately. So they may engage in drug use, challenging behaviors. And this area is not often assessed or targeted appropriately, but it's one of the most difficult things for people with a traumatic brain injury. Also, neurotypical people have the ideas to start with, whereas people with a traumatic brain injury don't have those ideas. So they can fall back into, very unhelpful routines quite easily. Poor impulse controls quite common, so they may behave and interact inappropriately, which may result in further social isolation. Sexual disinhibition, so crude comments, invading people's space, inappropriate touching, and hyper or hyposexuality. Social disinhibition, so insight and awareness, again, is impaired and can impact on social cognition. Confabulation can be quite common. So this is known as honest lying, and it's the production or creation of false or erroneous memories without the intent to deceive. You can really start to see how all of these processes hugely interact with one another and can, result in quite devastating effects. Increased risk of psychosis. So that's where thought and emotions are so impaired that contact is lost with external reality. Organic personality disorder is quite common too, and this is it's not classed as a personality disorder like borderline or antisocial is, but it's known as a significant alteration of the habitual patterns of premorbid behavior. So it's those significant changes following the index injury. And also false tagging theory. So, individuals with an altered prefrontal cortex, structural integrity, can have a doubt deficit, meaning they're really vulnerable to believe inaccurate information and kind of holding on to that. But again, these difficulties can interact with one another and further exacerbate and impact on social and communication skills. There's also some additional factors that needs to be taken into account. So if we go to our next slide, I am now going to introduce and discuss the interactions between social emotional mental health needs and traumatic brain injury. So social emotional mental health needs are a type of special educational need where a child communicates through behavior in response to unmet social, emotional, or mental health needs. Now, the key here is communicates. So children and young people who have difficulties with their emotional and social development may have immature social skills and find it difficult to make and sustain healthy relationships. These difficulties may be displayed through the young person becoming withdrawn or isolated, as well as through challenging, disruptive, or disturbing behavior. SEMH can manifest as difficulties relating to problems of mood, such as anxiety or depression, problems of conduct, so behavior, so oppositional defiance, or more severe challenging behaviors such as aggression, self-harm, substance abuse, eating disorders, or physical symptoms that are medically unexplained as the result of trauma. The Body Keeps the Score. Highly recommend everybody's reading that book. Most common causes include trauma, attachment needs, and complicated dynamics that surround the child. So this could be things like environment, family, but also those kind of external systems in place. So judicial, educational, health. So how does this all relate to TBI? Let's look at the next slide. So 77% of children in pupil referral units, PRUs, have SEMH. There's a PRU to prison pipeline. So in 2017, 2018, 89% of children in detention had been excluded from school. Gang-associated children and young people overrepresent on children with SEMH difficulties. 23% of gang-associated children and young people have SEMH identified as their primary special educational need. Once these demographic differences are accounted for, this is 95% more than other children assessed by Children's Services. However, being an offending type can make having a brain injury more likely. TBI is significantly more prevalent in the population of young offenders than in the general population. It's actually estimated to be as high as 74% to 87%. Globally, the prevalence of TBI among offenders is estimated at 40 to 60%. TBI is an independent risk factor for criminal activity and subsequent incarcerations, and there's growing evidence of links between incurring a TBI and subsequent offending. Nationally, 6% of young offenders also have speech, language, and communication needs. So we can really see a lot of correlations are emerging here. Now let's take a closer look. Low socioeconomic status is associated with greater risk of a traumatic brain injury, TBI at an early age, and more severe TBI and repeated TBI. However, low socioeconomic status is also a risk factor for SEMH needs. Children from socially disadvantaged families are more than twice as likely to be identified as having a speech, language, and communication need. But due to social clustering, more than 50% of children living in areas of high social deprivation may start school with speech, language, and communication needs. Therefore, those with low socioeconomic status are at greater risk of speech, language, and communication needs, socio-emotional mental health needs, and sustaining a traumatic brain injury. But all three of these risks also interact with one another. Let's look at a list of these symptoms on the next slide. You know, what are these symptoms of? So these are actually a list of symptoms of socio-emotional mental health, but you can see how these are also a list of symptoms of TBI, and how some of them may also be a result of speech, language, and communication needs, such as unable to make and maintain friendship, you know, social anxiety, task avoidance, or disproportionate reactions to situations. So what might come first? Let's look at this next slide. Sorry, I really think this slide is just kind of a great way that really shows how all of these different risk factors massively interact, you know, and low socioeconomic status, you know, you've got increased risk of SEMH, which then increased risk of challenging behavior or exclusion, further increased risk of TBI, then that goes back to speech, language, and communication needs. It's just an absolute web. And what comes first really? Is it the chicken or the egg? It's a complex presentation of risk factors, such as adverse childhood and or adult life experience in conjunction with epigenetic cumulative adversity. All factors need to be taken into account when working with clients within this population, and understanding how all these needs intrinsically interact and impact on one another. It's essential to approach these intricacies with a trauma-informed approach and compassionate understanding. Let's look at the next slide and discuss what is trauma. A traumatic event is defined as an event that causes a long-term dysregulation in the autonomic and core extrapyramidal nervous system. Sustaining a traumatic brain injury could therefore exacerbate any pre-existing SEMH needs, or these needs may develop as a comorbidity. So the physical injury itself is a trauma, but there are also emotional injuries. So the experience of being involved with the accident, medical trauma, separation from caregivers during any kind of medical interventions, guilt, a lot of guilt can come following an accident, especially like primary caregivers. They may feel guilty if they weren't there or if they were there. But there's also then changes to self and identity, there's loss and grief. The list is really endless, and it's essential to understand how living in a trauma response will continue to perpetuate autonomic dysregulation, because there are wounds that never show on the body that are deeper and more hurtful than anything that bleeds. Okay, so where do speech and language therapists come in with all of this? Let's look. So we're going to take a little bit of a closer look now at the role of the speech and language therapist within this population. So if we orient ourselves back to the basics, I find this can be really helpful, especially if we are working with families or professionals who kind of have worked with speech and language therapists in the past, but it may be very much due to kind of a very specific speech or language disorder. So communication is the acts of giving, receiving, and sharing information. And the means in which an individual communicates varies widely. So, spoken language, AAC, sign language, but also behavior. Behavior is communication. So there's a huge overlap already between psychology and speech and language therapy. The reason why we engage with behaviors and communication fall into 4 categories mainly. So escape, so to avoid; attention, social interaction might be a kind of nice way to frame it, but attention; tangible, so that's receiving something that you actually want, whether it's a chocolate bar in the supermarket and your 2-year-old's having a tantrum, it's having that actual tangible; and for a sensory need. And that's not just kind of senses as in, sometimes we can really just home in and kind of like OT, sensory integration, sensory circuits, but senses are also emotions, feelings. So it's just kind of broadening our understanding sometimes of what sensory is as well. Let's look at our next slide. So first things first, we provide thorough and specific assessment that provides information regarding all of these areas. I think this kind of the speech and language assessments, probably what we're most commonly known for, really. But even just, thinking of kind of receptive language, that's all your understanding of spoken language, following instructions, recall, semantics, non-literal understanding, inference. So even just kind of in those basic language fundamentals, there's a lot that then overlaps again with those cognitive communication disorders. But then we also do, as I've said, social skills assessment, so going through that profile. But then we can also really support with behaviors and emotions, whether that's using a specific resource like language for behavior and emotions, or joint working with the MDT and exploring again more of what that child is or young person is able to understand and able to express. Once we've kind of completed our assessment, if we pop to the next slide, we then complete a really thorough formulation, which includes scoring assessment, interpreting that data, the quantitative data, but then also combining it with that qualitative information, such as reviewing case and medical history, and then providing a summary profile of needs and strengths, identifying long-term goals and SMART goals, and feeding back to the client where appropriate. This is not always appropriate. And I think really knowing the client and kind of having that good rapport with the client and the family around is essential in knowing a kind of how you pitch that. Yeah, I'm quite experienced in this area, and I went through a formulation with a client with significant SEMH and significant TBI, and he's 22 and he wants to be involved in kind of everything that's going on around him, and it wasn't good for rapport. So even though he wanted to and chose to, it wasn't Liaison with the team around the client, and then intervention can begin. Now, I personally like to kind of view intervention as 3 parts. So if we go to our next slide and look at that first part. So the first being direct skill development. So that's kind of your one-to-one. And we can, there's thousands of examples, but just briefly, this may include attention and listening, receptive language, so understanding and comprehension, expressive language, communication, speech, social communication, that's the biggie. I mainly work in social communication, emotional literacy and appropriate expression of feelings, and adaptive ways to communicate needs. And what I mean by that is how to appropriately have your needs met and communicate it instead of inappropriate behaviours or inappropriate language. It's always very colourful working in this area for sure. Now, if we look at our next slide, in my experience, offering functional skill support has been one of the most important roles SALT can provide, and it also yields the best results. So what I mean by this is kind of really being involved, and not just on that one-to-one basis, but could be in meetings, so supporting that the client is able to express their views and ensuring their voice is heard. So that's kind of prep work before joining them in the meeting, ensuring information is accessible and aiding comprehension. So all of my clients are actually within the medical legal sector, so there's lots of kind of litigation going on around them. And it's a lot of information, it's a lot of jargon, understanding financial deputies, it's a lot. And the speech and language therapists are absolutely vital in supporting the client, whoever it may be, to understand and figure out what is going on in the world around them, because we have been able to do such a thorough assessment of what they are able to understand. We are able to pitch it appropriately. Supporting with proactive, active and reactive behavioural strategies. So this is when, there is a client who is presenting with significant challenging behaviours, and there's often kind of triggers, things that build up to that, and you can kind of see those behaviours going in a spiral. So your proactive strategies are strategies that you kind of consistently try and embed to keep somebody regulated. Active strategies is during kind of the engagement within those behaviours, and then reactive strategies are kind of that coming down, reflection, calming, and kind of getting back into the body and regulating that nervous system. Now, the reason why we can support that is because when you're working with high level clients, a lot of this is going to be done through communication. And again, it's going to rely on the assessment of what that person is able to understand, communicate, express. But what we need to take into account is when you are in a sympathetic nervous system response, so when you're in fight or flight, or when you're in shutdown, your frontal lobe's kind of not as interacting as much as it would be. It's kind of gone to sleep a little bit, not fully obviously, but our limbic system's really in the driving seat, and all of those cognitive processes are far harder. And we've all had experiences of that, when we're really angry and we've had an argument and we can't remember what we said. We know we said something bad, but we can't remember exactly what it was. So that's just kind of a simple example of that. Applying social cognitive communication strategies to real life experiences clients have, and jointly problem solving social problems. So within my sessions, I don't use physical resources because my clients don't like that. But a lot of speech and language therapists may use kind of like color cards or scenario cards to kind of discuss different social scenarios. What I find, especially if we think of some of those comorbidities within brain injury, so difficulties with transferring skills outside of like one specific area where they've learned, is I start off a session having a catch up with the client, which is great for rapport as well, about what has happened over the past week. And if there's been any social difficulties or there's been any incidents, they do often open up about that. And then that's when we do all the teaching. So instead of using some random resource that has no meaning to them whatsoever, we actually use their real life experiences, and it helps promote the generalization of those strategies because it is meaningful for them. But also as well, providing support to understand new milestones in a client's life and how to interact and communicate appropriately within each of these new phases. So one of my clients has just this year started an apprenticeship. So he's in college on Monday, and then he's doing 3 hours of work the rest of the week. And with that, he's working in a warehouse, he's working with, older people. There's loads and loads of kind of social communication, cognitive communication skills that he's going to need that he's not ever needed before in the past, because he's been in a supportive college environment that have known him quite well. And preparation for formal meetings, as we discussed before. Now, if we look at our next slide, it's also super essential to ensure that the environment and team members around the client fully understand the client's needs and how best to support this. So this is known as indirect skill development, examples of which may include communication passport, report provision. It can be a variety of different resources, whatever is appropriate for the client. But that document needs to detail, that the client, whatever strategies the client finds useful. And it's really important to remember that this is a working document, and it grows and develops with the child and young person. The brain isn't going to be fully developed until mid-20s. So presentation, needs, strengths, it's all going to grow and develop as natural maturation either fails or continues. A system whereby everyone who supports the child or young person can access that document, as defined by the speech and language therapists. Formal training regarding a client's communicative profile of needs and strategies to support this. But it's not just enough to do the training. It's also how we support the embedding of these strategies. We can't just do a one-off training session. That's not going to be supportive. It's not going to be helpful. People aren't going to integrate those skills. We need to get in there and get modeling and kind of really have a cultural approach that really understands this. And it really is supporting people around that client. And it can be very difficult because sometimes the environment and the people around that client can be a facilitator. In my experience, a lot of the time it can be a barrier. So it is a huge area of work. And then ongoing liaison and open communication with the client and the team around that client, as I've just said. And it's just constantly that drip feed, drip feed, drip feed. Do your formal kind of intervention, give out all of that information, and then be there to model those strategies, be there when a family member needs to, be seen and heard and validated, so that they can then get it off their chest and go back to supporting a client how they need to support them. So if we look at our next slide, speech and language therapists can often be overlooked as a clinician who would work with clients in this area. Now, clients can be really, really skilled at masking their communicative needs, and their presentation may not indicate at all that they have a speech and language communication need. Instead, their presentation may be perceived as requiring only clinical and or neuropsychology input, or actually, their presentation may not appear as if they have any of these needs. This is why these children are ending up in PRUs, and a PRU into the justice system. It's because people do not view them as being in need. They view them as being naughty and being intentionally disruptive, lost cause. It's kind of this cultural perspective we have on behavior. And that's how a lot of things get missed. They aren't diagnosed with speech language communication needs, they aren't diagnosed with brain injury, and that's how they end up in the judicial system. And then they have a brain injury screen, and it turns out that 8% of people who are youth offending do have brain injuries, but that is not reflective in all the other kind of medical census that have been done. Following a brain injury, it's really important to remember that physical, cognitive, and emotional behavioral needs all interact with each other. Communication is involved with each of these processes. Speech and language therapists can provide crucial intervention that supports the development of communication, social skills, and emotional regulation and expression of this. Recognition of recurring and overlapping areas of intervention within neurorehabilitation is limited, alongside understanding of the full remit of a speech and language therapist. But I hope from today, these discussions, that our views and perceptions of the speech and language therapist role has begun to expand a little, and, the necessity of our involvement with clients from this population is evident. So in summary, we go to our next slide. Altered communication is common following traumatic brain injury. Cognitive communication difficulties resulted from disrupted cognition rather than specific language disorder are the most prevalent disorder. A cognitive communication disorder results from impaired functioning of one or more cognitive processes. A traumatic brain injury can impair any or multiple cognitive processes. Additional areas of comorbidity within traumatic brain injury further impacts communicative skills. Clients who have sustained traumatic brain injury may have pre-existing social-emotional mental health needs, which are further exacerbated, or SEMH needs may develop as a consequence of both trauma and communication needs that have arisen following the traumatic brain injury. This population has increased risk of speech, language, and communication needs prior to any index injury. Speech and language therapists are the experts in speech, language, and communication needs. We can provide crucial and invaluable intervention and support clients within this population. The views of what a speech, language, and communication the views of what speech, language, and communication needs are, alongside the views of what assault's remit is, urgently needs to be expanded and understood fully by the wider professional team. So there's a reference list on our next slide. But then after that, next slide. Thank you so much for joining me today and for your time, over your lunch. I really appreciate that. And I'd love to now open up the discussion section of this webinar and hear your experiences or any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emma. That was amazing as always. I always love hearing you talk about that. And you're clearly very, very passionate, which is lovely. So we have had a couple of questions here. There's one from Steph, who has asked, what would you class as a traumatic brain injury?
Okay, so if acquired brain injury is like an umbrella term for kind of all injuries, and then from that you have two different strands. You have a non-traumatic brain injury, but this is usually just referred to as an acquired brain injury, or you have a TBI. However, a TBI is also an acquired brain injury. So traumatic brain injury is caused by trauma. So it can be closed, so that's usually by force and impacts. It can be open, so that can be penetrating, or it can be crushing. Does that make sense? An acquired brain injury is usually organic, so it's things like stroke, aneurysms kind of bleeds on the brain, whereas then your traumatic brain injury is acquired by trauma. It doesn't, most people kind of think of like open penetrating wounds, but that's not the most common kind of closed wound is. So if you think of road traffic accident, you may hit the front of your head on the steering wheel, and then that causes force, basically acceleration, and the brain is suspended within kind of fluid, and it can kind of twist and turn and contra-coup and scatter, like kind of, because the inside of our skull is a little bit bony as well, so if the frontal lobe kind of hits that with blunt force, it can then kind of cause a scatter injury as well. I hope that covers that, but if not,
yeah, that's really helpful, thank you.
No worries.
I work in a school for children that have got cerebral palsy, so I was just trying to sort of think about, where they fit into this sort of, as you say, the umbrella term. So yeah,
absolutely. And do you know, I think I commonly refer to traumatic brain injury simply because that tends to be the area in which I work with the SEMH side of things. But within our team, within AT therapy, there's a high percentage of our caseload also have cerebral palsy. And within that population too, there is a lot of social emotional mental health needs. And a lot of these things are really common and transferable. So like LK, you found it quite useful, haven't you? Kind of the internal trauma informed stuff we've been doing, and that it can really transfer and generalize to other kind of injuries.
Yeah, it's been amazing to learn some stuff from you, Emma, because my clients, Emma gets the more significant end of the scale, but my clients have a lot of I've got a large proportion of clients with cerebral palsy, Steph, and I even the kind of the ones that you maybe wouldn't class as being completely significant in terms of their SEMH needs, it's been really, really relevant to apply to them. So yeah, definitely very useful. Thank you so much for that, Steph. The next question is from Carrie. She said, is there a specific type of speech and language therapist to look out for, such as if an adult has TBI, PTSD, and other co-occurring disorders?
So I've always been in the private kind of sector, like, so before being with AT therapy, which is kind of predominantly in medical legal or private contracts with schools, I was employed directly by a school and then I've come here. So I can't answer too much about kind of NHS kind of referral pathways and different kind of groups. I would, and it's difficult sometimes because of, you know, the pressure and funding difficulties. You may want to refer to brain injury, but then need to refer to SEMH, and it's kind of, it's as if you think you've got yellow glasses on and you can only see yellow dots, and those are SEMH. But then if you put green glasses on, you can then only see the green dots, which is TBI. And then if you put on the red glasses, you can see the red dots, which is trauma. We all kind of need to wear multicolored glasses all the time to see these kids as a whole. So I'd be looking for, and it might have to be done kind of on a who you know basis. Who do you know in this work that's trauma informed, that understands youth offending, and then if they understand youth offending, they're likely going to understand SEMH and traumatic brain injury. So if there's anybody else who kind of works in the NHS, I think Claire Westwood, right, who is kind of queen in this area too, then please do share more. But it might just be the case of kind of who you know. Yeah, so I'm skipping ahead here. Sorry, but I've just seen Claire Hobbs, thank you so much. I think there are many therapists, but it's the capacity under so much pressure now, and many children. Yeah, and I feel you on that. And again, yeah, depending on your geographical area, we all experience kind of those different postcode lotteries. And I know it's kind of not great to say that, but sometimes I think a little bit of reality orientation is necessary, and it does depend on where you are and the services that are available due to funding within that area. There's absolutely a need for it, and I guess it's all our responsibilities to really push that to the people who create the funding. And the more we kind of raise awareness of this need and how much we can help, and how much that will help social policy, you know, like reducing intelligent behaviours, reducing incarcerations, then perhaps we may see some funding increases. But that's super optimistic and is a long-term goal, I think. So I hope that kind of answers your question to some degree.
Thanks, Emma. I think it's always those clients that hide their difficulties so well that end up being the most vulnerable, really, and slip through the net, which is really scary.
Yeah, I sorry, I was just going to add, I had a college teacher tell me that a client didn't need referring to the NHS speech and language therapy because they didn't have speech and language therapy needs. So that that's coming from a highly specialist speech and language therapist advising somebody to make a referral, because there was most definitely speech, language and communication needs. They just weren't able to kind of self-fund private anymore. So yeah, that's sometimes what we're coming up against. But yeah, sorry, Laura.
It's all right. The next one is from Tamsin, who has said, do you have a cloud-based or electronic system that you recommend for sharing communication passports and things, so that people in the team, I guess, can update it, but everyone can view the most recent version?
So in the way in which we work, we have it's like bubbles around each different client. We rarely kind of work with the same the same people each time for each client. So in our area of work, it really depends on the client. So some people are happy to kind of use like Google Documents. Other people, I think it's called SharePoint. Is that Microsoft? I should know it, but it's just saved on my tabs, so I don't have to remember it. So kind of those different sharing platforms. And then when I've been in schools, they kind of have their own systems. Sometimes might be like QNote or like behavioral supports. They all kind of have different systems in place. I understand again though that sometimes that might be harder for people who are employed within the NHS because of the GDP rules and stuff around sharing. So we're very, very lucky. I'm just going to put that out there, but we kind of do it on a needs basis. The most common one we use is Google Docs or SharePoint, and Team Up. There's another one as well called Dropbox, which we use too. So it's just kind of all those like OneDrive sharing platforms really that are readily available and free. But then when I have been kind of like in education, they've had their own systems as well. We also use a thing called Goal Manager a lot, but that is, you do have to pay for that, and I think it's not perhaps like a cheap or a free option, which are available. So it just depends on kind of the area that you're working into, I guess.
Yeah, I would agree, Emma. So each of my clients, Tamsin, have either a Dropbox account that everyone from the MDT can access and add things to, or a Google Docs, Google Drive kind of account, again, where people add things to. And also, again, you can see who's updated what then as well, which is quite handy. Thank you for that question. We've got some lovely comments, Emma. Thank you, Emma. That was amazing. Great webinar. Thanks, Emma. You're so knowledgeable and passionate about this work. I completely agree.
Sorry, I just wanted to say I realised really like partway through that actually one of your colleagues, Lois, comes in and works in our school. So I was like, AT therapy, I've definitely heard that from somewhere else. So yeah, Lois comes in every week and she's amazing. So yeah.
Amazing. We're really spreading at the minute. So yeah, hopefully you'll kind of be able to see us all a bit more and stuff as well. But yeah, we do have school contracts too, so we may cross paths in school, or we work in conjunction a lot with NHS therapists, so Tamsin, we've worked a lot with AT therapy, so there is loads of overlap. We're just there to top up sometimes as part of kind of that medical legal case that's going on in the background.
Absolutely. Freya said that's been so interesting. Thank you so much. Oliver has asked, will there be a recording of this webinar available? And I can answer that one. Absolutely, there is. So the recording will be on our website and also on our YouTube channel as well, which is where all of our previous webinars have also been put as well. Those are all the questions I have in the chat. Does anyone else have any others? speak now.
Forever hold your peace.
So we've got some resources, like I said, our YouTube channel. We've got a few Instagram accounts, which always have lots of freebies and little bits of information on. So go and check those out. We've also got our Facebook account, which is where a lot of people find out a lot of information about us, because we share some great stuff on there. We have an event coming up from the amazing Nikki Jones, who is another one of our highly specialist speech and language therapists, which is a play included training. So the old kind of brick therapy, that'll be this winter, not quite sure on the date yet, but we will get that sorted for you. So contact us if you want some information on that. We've obviously also got more courses coming up. So our next little free webinar will be on the 18th of November. And we have Judith James from ECMS, who is an education advisor, talking all things EHCP. So if you want to join that one, hop onto Eventbrite and sign up. And that is everything. Thank you so much, guys.
Thank you so much as well for all of the comments as well, and just seeing Bob's come in too. So thank you so much, everybody. I really appreciate your time. Thank you.